The call came through at 5:17 a.m. Eastern Standard Time to a room that officially didn't exist. Three generals sat in a windowless chamber buried 4 stories beneath the Pentagon, their faces lit by the cold glow of classified monitors. The Sensitive Compartmented Information Facility, SCIF, in the language of those who trafficked in secrets, smelled of recycled air and strong coffee gone bitter from sitting too long. General Elena Briggs leaned forward, her reading glasses catching the light. 62 years old, decorated for operations in 17 countries, she'd seen intelligence reports that would make civilians question everything they thought they knew about the world. But the data scrolling across her screen now made her hand pause halfway to her coffee cup. "This can't be right," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. General Raymond Blackwood looked up from his own terminal. At 65, he'd earned his 4th star through wars fought in deserts and mountains, through conflicts that newspapers called by sanitized names, while the reality dripped with blood and sand. He'd buried friends. He'd written letters to widows. He'd made decisions that haunted his sleep. "What are you seeing, Elena?" His Scottish ancestry colored his vowels just enough to notice. Briggs rotated her monitor. The biometric readout displayed a name, a photograph from 5 years ago, and a status designation that glowed red against the black background. Thornwell, Cassandra M. State, KIA, October 15, 2019. Operation, Ghost Rain, classified. But beneath that, in real-time data that updated every 3 seconds, another line pulsed green. Biometric match, positive. Location, Fort Carson, Colorado. Time, 6:32 Mountain Standard Time. The third general, a man whose name would never appear in this account because some clearances transcend even this telling, stood abruptly. His chair scraped against the floor, the sound too loud in the tomb-like quiet. "Thornwell was at the center of the Belgrade facility when it detonated," he said, his words clipped, imprecise. "We have satellite imagery of the explosion. We recovered fragments of her gear from the rubble. We held a memorial service." Briggs removed her glasses, rubbed the bridge of her nose. She'd given the eulogy at that service. She'd stood before Cassandra's sister Emma and promised that Cass had died serving something greater than herself. She'd believed it. She'd had to believe it because the alternative, that they'd abandon one of their own, was unthinkable. "If she survived that blast," Briggs said quietly, "and she's been alive for 5 years without contacting us," Blackwood finished the thought, "then either she couldn't reach us or she chose not to." The room fell silent again. Outside, the world was waking up, commuters fighting traffic, coffee shops opening, the ordinary rhythm of ordinary lives. Down here, in this buried room where America's secrets were kept, 3 people who'd ordered death from the sky and sent soldiers into the dark were confronting a ghost. "Get me Fort Carson's commanding officer," Briggs said. "Now." 2,000 miles west, the Colorado sun was just beginning to paint the eastern sky in shades of amber and gold. Fort Carson spread across the landscape south of Colorado Springs like a small city unto itself. 130,000 acres of training grounds, barracks, command buildings, and the sprawling infrastructure required to house and prepare thousands of soldiers. The mountains rose in the distance, the peaks still holding snow even though summer was coming. The air was thin and clean, carrying the scent of pine and dust. At the main gate, Specialist Danny Morrison checked his watch. 6:28, 2 more hours on gate duty, then breakfast, then back to his unit for another day of training exercises. 20 years old, fresh from basic, still young enough to think the uniform made him invincible. A figure approached from the civilian side, walking with a strange, subtle hitch in her gait that Morrison almost didn't notice. She wore what looked like an old Army combat uniform, the pattern faded from too many washings, the fabric worn at the elbows and knees. No name tape, no unit patch, no rank insignia, just gray-green fabric hanging loose on a frame that seemed too thin, too weathered. Morrison stepped forward, hand not quite resting on his sidearm. Procedure. Always procedure. "Ma'am, I need to see your identification and entry authorization." The woman stopped 3 feet from the checkpoint barrier. Morrison got his first good look at her face and felt something cold touch the base of his spine. She was maybe 30, 35, hard to tell. Brown hair that had once been cut military short, but had grown out in waves that the wind caught and pulled. Eyes the color of steel, or old ice, or something that had been forged in heat and then left to cool in absolute darkness. Skin that had seen too much sun, too many weathers. Cheekbones sharp enough to cut. But it was the eyes. There was something in those eyes that made Morrison think of his grandfather, the one who'd come back from Vietnam and never quite came all the way home. The woman reached into her jacket pocket. Morrison tensed, but her movements were slow, deliberate, like someone who understood how gestures could be misread in the space between heartbeats. She pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn soft at the creases, and handed it to him. Morrison unfolded it, read it once, read it again, looked up at the woman, then back down at the paper. It was a death certificate. Thornwell, Cassandra Marie. Date of death, October 15th, 2019. Cause, killed in action. Location, Belgrade, Serbia. Circumstances, classified. The photograph on the certificate matched the face in front of him, allowing for 5 years of hard living. "Ma'am," Morrison heard himself say, his voice cracking slightly, "this document says you're deceased." The woman's expression didn't change. Those steel gray eyes held his, and for a moment Morrison felt like he was being measured, weighed, assessed according to some criteria he couldn't begin to understand. "I was," she said. Her voice was quiet, roughened by something. Smoke, screaming, silence. He couldn't tell. "For 5 years I was dead. Now I'm not." She walked past him through the barrier gate. Morrison stood frozen, the death certificate still in his hand, watching her move across the checkpoint with that subtle, almost imperceptible limp. By the time his brain started working again, she was 50 yards into the base, heading toward the main training grounds. He should have stopped her, should have called his sergeant, should have done something other than stand there like a statue while a woman carrying her own death certificate walked onto a secure military installation. But he didn't. Some part of him, the part that his grandfather might have recognized, knew that stopping her would have been like trying to stop a force of nature. You don't command the wind. You don't give orders to the tide. You just get out of the way. The training field at Fort Carson could hold 800 soldiers in formation. This morning, it held 200 recruits running through basic combat drills, their boots raising dust devils in the dry Colorado air. The cadence of their counts carried across the field. 1, 2, 3, 4, punctuated by the bark of their drill instructors. Sergeant Blake Morrison, no relation to the gate guard, stood with his arms crossed, watching his platoon execute push-ups with varying degrees of competence. At 28, Morrison had done a tour in Afghanistan that he didn't talk about and carried himself with the aggressive confidence of someone who'd been tested and survived. He had the kind of face that looked like it was carved from harder wood than most, all angles and shadows, with eyes that constantly scanned for weakness. He was the first to notice the woman walking across the training field. She moved through the morning light like she was part of it and separate from it at the same time. That faded uniform hanging off her shoulders, that long, steady stride that somehow looked wrong, like something mechanical trying to imitate organic movement. Her eyes fixed on the middle distance, not looking at the recruits, not looking at the instructors, not looking at anything except whatever destination existed in her mind. Morrison stepped away from his platoon, his jaw tightening. "Hey!" His voice cut across the field, making several recruits stumble in their exercises. "You, civilian!" The woman stopped, didn't turn toward him, just stopped walking, standing perfectly still in a way that somehow seemed more deliberate than movement. Morrison closed the distance, his boots hitting the ground with the heavy rhythm of authority. Several other instructors had noticed now, were drifting closer. This was entertainment. This was a break in the monotony. This was someone in the wrong place, and wrong places got corrected with volume and venom. "I asked you a question," Morrison said, circling to face her. "Who the hell are you? And what makes you think you can walk onto my training field?" Up close, he could see the details. The way her uniform had been patched in places with thread that didn't quite match. The scuffed boots that had seen real miles, real terrain. The empty spaces on her chest where name tape and rank should have been. And her hands, weathered and scarred, hanging loose at her sides in a way that looked relaxed, but somehow wasn't. The woman's eyes focused on him, and Morrison felt that same cold touch that Danny Morrison had felt at the gate, like being noticed by a predator that had decided, for now, not to be hungry. "I'm here to see the commanding officer," she said quietly. "Oh, you're here to see the CO?" Morrison's voice dripped with sarcasm now, playing to the crowd of instructors and recruits that was gathering. "Just walked onto a secure base to have a chat with a two-star general? Lady, I don't know what soup kitchen you wandered away from, but this ain't it." Laughter rippled through the watching soldiers. Young laughter, the kind that comes easy when you're not the target. Morrison grinned, feeding off it. "Check it out," he continued, gesturing to the woman's bare uniform. "No name tape, no unit patch, no rank. You know what that means, boys and girls? That means we got ourselves a fake, an imposter. Probably came here looking for a free meal and thought she'd play dress-up." The woman didn't react, didn't flush with embarrassment or anger, didn't drop her eyes, didn't offer explanation or excuse. She just stood there, breathing slow and steady, her gaze resting on Morrison like he was something slightly interesting, but ultimately irrelevant. That stillness infuriated him more than resistance would have. "Matter of fact," Morrison said, reaching out to grab her canvas shoulder bag, "let's see what we got here. Let's see what kind of gear a fake soldier carries." His hand closed on the bag's strap. For a fraction of a second, the woman's eyes flicked down to where he'd touched her equipment, and something moved behind those gray irises, something cold and calculating and utterly without mercy. Then it was gone, smoothed over like a stone at the bottom of a river. Morrison yanked the bag off her shoulder, upended it. The contents spilled onto the dirt. A photograph, old and creased, showing 4 figures in dark tactical gear, their faces obscured by shadow and distance. An antique compass, brass and scratched, with an inscription too small to read from Morrison's angle. A small folding knife, the handle worn smooth from years of use, but the blade clean and oiled. A pack of iodine tablets, a small sewing kit. Nothing that meant anything, and yet everything about these objects spoke of careful maintenance, of items chosen for utility and carried for purpose. "This?" Morrison held up the photograph, laughing. "This is your proof? Some blurry picture you probably found in a thrift store?" He tossed it back into the dirt. The woman's eyes tracked the photograph as it fell. Her fingers twitched once, a tiny movement that might have been the beginning of a reach before it was suppressed. When she looked back up at Morrison, her expression hadn't changed, but somehow the temperature around them seemed to drop several degrees. Captain Victoria Kincaid had been watching from the shade of the command building's overhang, sipping coffee from a metal mug and preparing for the morning briefing. She'd noticed the commotion on the field, the gathering crowd, and now she strode across the training grounds with the measured pace of someone accustomed to being obeyed. 35 years old, blonde hair pulled back in a regulation bun so tight it could have been painted on. Uniform pressed with creases sharp enough to draw blood. Kincaid carried herself like nobility among peasants, the daughter of decorated military lineage who'd never quite understood that respect is earned through sweat and not inherited through surnames. "What's going on here, Sergeant?" Her voice had that particular quality of authority that comes from never having been truly tested. Morrison snapped to attention. "Ma'am, found this woman trespassing on the training field. No identification, no authorization. I believe she's impersonating military personnel." Kincaid circled the woman slowly, her eyes taking in every detail with the practiced assessment of someone cataloging deficiencies. The worn uniform, the missing insignia, the woman herself, standing at something that wasn't quite parade rest, but also wasn't civilian casualness. Something in between, something other. "Name," Kincaid demanded. The woman was silent for 3 heartbeats. 4, 5. When she finally spoke, her voice carried no more emotion than someone reading a weather report. "Cassandra Thornwell." "Rank and unit, Thornwell." Another pause. "I don't have one anymore." Kincaid's expression hardened. "You don't have one anymore, I see. So you're admitting you're not active military." "I didn't say that." "Then what are you saying?" The woman, Cassandra, tilted her head slightly, and for a moment Kincaid had the unsettling sensation of being studied by something that saw more than she wanted seen. "I'm saying I don't have a rank or unit anymore," Cassandra repeated, each word falling like a stone into still water. "Not since October 15th, 2019. Kincaid's jaw tightened. This was resistance, however passive. This was someone not understanding their place in the hierarchy. This required correction. "Sergeant Morrison," she said, her voice carrying across the field, "set up a placard. Imposter. Let's make an example. Middle of the field, under the sun. Maybe the heat will loosen her tongue." They brought a wooden signboard, the kind usually reserved for training scenarios, and placed it behind Cassandra. Morrison used a thick black marker to write in letters large enough to be read from across the field. "Imposter." "Stand there," Kincaid ordered. "Don't move until you're ready to explain yourself properly." The morning sun was already climbing, temperature rising toward the mid-90s that characterize Colorado summer days. The kind of heat that would bake someone standing motionless in full uniform. The kind of heat that was calculated to break resistance through simple, relentless discomfort. Cassandra walked to the center of the field, stood beneath the sign, positions her feet shoulder-width apart, weight balanced, hands loose at her sides. And then she became absolutely, perfectly still. The recruits went back to their exercises, but eyes kept drifting toward the figure standing alone under the climbing sun. The instructors returned to their duties, but conversations were punctuated with glances in her direction. It was supposed to be humiliating. It was supposed to make her beg for mercy, plead for water, offer explanation or excuse. But Cassandra just stood there. An hour passed. The sun climbed higher. Sweat began to darken the fabric of her uniform, but her breathing never changed. Slow and deep and absolutely controlled. Her eyes stayed fixed on the mountain range in the distance, as if she could see something there that no one else could perceive. Lieutenant Owen Hartley watched from the Technical Operations Building, his coffee forgotten on the desk beside him. 32 years old, a specialist in communications and intelligence systems, Hartley had been recruited out of MIT and carried the particular kind of smart that comes from solving puzzles most people can't even see. He'd been reviewing overnight reports when he'd noticed the commotion on the training field, and something about the scene bothered him. The woman's stance, the way she held herself, the controlled breathing visible even from this distance. That wasn't civilian posture. That wasn't even regular military posture. That was something else, something Hartley had seen once before in a classified briefing about Tier 1 operators and the way they existed in the world. Simultaneously present and removed, anchored in their bodies while their minds calculated angles and distances and threat assessments. He pulled up the base entry logs on his computer, scanning backward through the morning's gate traffic. There, 6:32, a civilian entry flagged but not blocked. Notation from Specialist Morrison at the gate. Individual presented death certificate as ID, unable to process, allowed entry pending supervision. Death certificate? Hartley pulled the scanned image, read it twice, felt something cold settle in his chest. He picked up his phone, then set it down, picked it up again, tried to decide who to call, what to say, whether he was seeing patterns that weren't there or ignoring patterns that were. On the training field, Cassandra stood motionless under the sun. 2 hours now, the sign behind her casting a shadow that had rotated with the light. Her face was slick with sweat, but her eyes remained fixed on the horizon, and her hands had not moved even a fraction of an inch. Kincaid passed by on her way to another building, spared a glance at the figure standing in the heat, felt a flicker of satisfaction. Everyone broke eventually. It was just a matter of time and pressure. But something else moved across her face as she looked at Cassandra. Something that might have been doubt, or might have been recognition of something she didn't want to acknowledge. She pushed it away and kept walking. By the time they brought Cassandra to the medical tent at 11 a.m., she'd been standing in the sun for 4 hours. Her lips were cracked. Her uniform was soaked through with sweat. But when she walked, she still moved with that same mechanical precision, and her eyes still held that same distant focus. Dr. James Whitmore looked up from his paperwork as the MPS brought her in. 60 years old, with gray hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades in field hospitals and forward operating bases, Whitmore had sewn up soldiers in the Gulf and held dying men in Afghanistan, and learned to recognize 100 different ways the human body could break. He'd also learned to recognize the ones who'd been broken and rebuilt themselves into something harder. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the examination table. Cassandra sat, moved with practiced economy, no wasted motion. Whitmore noticed the hitch in her movement, the way she compensated with her right leg to protect her left. "We need a standard medical check," one of the MPs said. "Make sure she's not carrying anything." Whitmore nodded, waited for them to step outside. Then he moved closer, pulling on latex gloves with practice snaps. "I need to check your vitals," he said, arms out. Cassandra extended her arms. Whitmore wrapped the blood pressure cuff around her right bicep, pumped it up, watched the gauge. 118/75. Remarkable, given she'd just spent 4 hours in the sun. Pulse was 62, slow and steady like a distance runner's. He moved to check her left arm, rolling up the sleeve of her uniform, and stopped. There, running from her inner wrist up along the underside of her forearm, was a scar that made Whitmore's breath catch in his chest. Not a jagged wound from combat or accident, not the clean line of surgery, something else entirely. A Z-shaped pattern of stitching so precise it looked almost artistic, the kind of suture work that required specialized training and absolutely steady hands. Whitmore had seen that pattern exactly twice before in his 40-year career, both times on the bodies of operators from units that technically didn't exist, during medical evaluations that had been classified above his pay grade even to witness. His hands, steady through decades of battlefield medicine, began to shake. "Where did you get this scar?" His voice came out rougher than he intended. Cassandra looked at her own wrist, as if seeing it for the first time in a long while. "Sierra Madre Mountains, Mexico, 2016. "Who performed this suture?" "I did." Whitmore looked up sharply. "You did this to yourself?" "Field amputation. I didn't have clean water, proper tools, or anesthetic. I had fishing line and a bottle of mezcal." Her voice was flat, reciting facts the way someone might describe changing a tire. "The Z pattern helps prevent infection in compromised environments, allows drainage while maintaining structural integrity." She was reciting from a manual that Whitmore had seen referenced in classified medical briefings about deep reconnaissance operations and survival techniques taught to the military's most elite units. His hands moved almost without conscious thought, rolling the sleeve higher, checking her upper arm. There, burn scars. Not the random pattern of accidental fire, but the distinctive chemical signature of thermite burns. Third degree, healed, but permanent. Thermite grenade, he said softly. Cassandra nodded once. You were holding it when it detonated. Another nod. That's not possible. Thermite burns at over 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The blast alone. I was wearing Kevlar gloves. Held it for 4 seconds, then threw it. Burned through to bone, but the timer gave me enough time to place it exactly where it needed to be. Whitmore stepped back, removing his gloves. His mind was racing through protocols, clearance levels, the question of what exactly he was dealing with. The tent flap opened. Captain Kincaid entered, followed by Sergeant Morrison. Well? Kincaid's voice was clipped. Is she clean? Whitmore looked at Cassandra, who was staring straight ahead, her expression completely neutral. Then he looked at Kincaid. Captain, I think we need to... Simple question, Doctor. Yes or no? Whitmore's jaw tightened. There are some unusual scarring patterns that I think warrant... For God's sake, Kincaid interrupted. She's been standing in the sun for 4 hours playing games. If you're not hiding anything, she said, turning to Cassandra, then you won't mind taking off your shirt. Let's see if you have any unit tattoos, any real proof you've actually served. The tent went quiet. Even Morrison looked uncomfortable now, shuffling his feet. Cassandra looked at Kincaid for a long moment. Something moved in those gray eyes. Not fear, not anger, something colder and more patient. I don't have tattoos, she said quietly. Then prove it. Shirt off, now. Cassandra stood slowly. Her hands moved to the buttons of her combat shirt, fingers working with mechanical precision. She undid each button from top to bottom, no hesitation, no shame, no resistance. The shirt came off. She stood there in her tan undershirt, and for a moment Kincaid looked triumphant, ready to point out the absence of any identifying marks. Then Cassandra turned around. The scars were impossible to miss. 3 of them, running parallel down the length of her spine, from just below her shoulder blades to the small of her back. Not ragged wounds from combat, not surgical scars from medical procedures. These were deliberate, precise, blade-thin cuts that had been made with surgical instruments and healed with meticulous care. They weren't random, they were ritual. The tent became absolutely, utterly silent. Whitmore's face had gone white. He'd taken 2 steps backward without realizing it, his hand coming up to cover his mouth. Morrison was frozen in place, his earlier bravado draining away like water through his fingers. Kincaid stood staring, her mind trying to process what she was seeing, trying to fit it into some framework that made sense. Outside the tent, there was a commotion, voices raised in surprise, the sound of boots hitting gravel at double time. General Marcus Webb had been walking from his office to the command briefing room, reviewing the morning's reports on a tablet when he'd passed near the medical tent. Through the open flap, just for a second, he'd caught a glimpse of someone standing with their back turned, 3 parallel scars visible against pale skin. He'd frozen mid-step. The tablet slipped from his fingers, hit the concrete with a crack that sent spiderweb fractures across the screen. Webb was 64 years old. He'd commanded troops in 3 war zones. He'd made decisions that sent young men and women into darkness, knowing some wouldn't come back. He'd been briefed on operations that would remain classified for 50 years after his death. And he'd given the eulogy at a memorial service 5 years ago for an operator who died completing a mission so black that her family was never allowed to know the truth of what she'd accomplished. He'd looked at the photograph they'd used at that service, a woman with gray eyes and a slight smile that never quite reached those eyes, wearing her dress uniform with quiet pride. He'd promised her sister that Cassandra had died serving something greater than herself. He'd believed it. He'd had to believe it. Now he was walking toward the medical tent, his heart hammering in his chest in a way it hadn't since he'd taken enemy fire during the Gulf War. His hands were shaking. His breath was coming fast. He pushed through the tent flap, saw her standing there, shirt off, those 3 scars like accusations written in flesh. "Everyone out," Webb said, his voice cracking. "Now, MPS, Captain Kincaid, Sergeant Morrison, out." They hesitated, confused by the tremor in their commanding general's voice. "I said out!" They scrambled for the exit. Whitmore lingered, caught between medical responsibility and military hierarchy, but Webb's eyes found his. "Doctor, you too, and not a word of this. To anyone, that's a direct order." Whitmore went. The tent was empty except for 2 people. A general who'd ordered missions that changed the world in ways the world would never know, and a woman who'd carried out those missions and paid prices that couldn't be calculated in money or medals. Webb stood there, 5 feet from Cassandra, and for a long moment he couldn't speak, couldn't make his throat work, couldn't push words past the guilt and horror and impossible relief that was choking him. Then, slowly, like a man whose legs had forgotten how to hold his weight, General Marcus Webb sank to both knees on the medical tent floor. His head bowed. His hands came up, palms open in a gesture that might have been surrender or supplication, or both. "Commander Thornwell," he whispered, and his voice broke on the name. "We thought you were gone. We thought you were dead." Cassandra looked down at him. Slowly, she pulled her shirt back on, buttoning it with the same mechanical precision. When she spoke, her voice was quiet and utterly without inflection. "You thought correctly," she said, "until 3 days ago." She moved past him toward the tent opening, her gait still carrying that subtle hitch, and paused with her hand on the canvas flap. "Now I'm here to deliver something," she said, "and then I'll disappear again." She stepped out into the Colorado sunlight, leaving Webb kneeling alone in the tent, his head still bowed, his hands still open, his mind reeling with the implications of a ghost made flesh. Outside, the word was spreading, first in whispers, then in urgent phone calls, then in the sudden activation of base-wide security protocols that hadn't been tested outside of drills. Alarms began to sound, not the emergency sirens for active threats, but something else, something most of the soldiers on Fort Carson had never heard before. A deep, resonant tone that pulsed 3 times, paused, then pulsed 3 times again. Presidential Code Black. The automated security system, triggered by biometric data that Webb had entered from his phone with shaking fingers, began broadcasting across every speaker on the base. "All personnel, stand to attention." The voice was mechanical, synthesized, carrying the weight of classification protocols that transcended normal military hierarchy. "Special Operations Officer present, maximum security measures in effect." On the training field, 200 recruits stopped mid-exercise and snapped to attention, not understanding but obeying. In the command buildings, officers looked up from their work, confusion giving way to the trained response of standing and saluting toward the nearest speaker. In the motor pool, the mess hall, the barracks, across every corner of Fort Carson's vast complex, soldiers came to attention. The mechanical voice continued. "Now announcing Commander Cassandra Marie Thornwell." A pause, 2 seconds of silence that felt like hours. "Codename Phantom." Another pause. 12 confirmed eliminations, Tier 0 classification, 2012 to 2019. The words fell like hammers. 3 presidential unit citations, black file operations. Somewhere in the crowd of frozen soldiers, someone's weapon clattered to the ground. No one moved to pick it up. Status, previously declared killed in action. Operation Ghost Rain, October 15, 2019. The mechanical voice paused one final time. "If Commander Thornwell is confirmed alive and present, all personnel will render appropriate honors." Silence. Then, starting with the soldiers closest to the medical tent and spreading outward like a wave, 2,000 men and women came to attention so sharp it was like watching dominoes fall in reverse. Arms snapped up in salute, Boots struck gravel and concrete in perfect unison. The sound echoed off the mountains. And in the center of it all, standing alone outside a medical tent, with the Colorado sun painting her shadow long across the ground, Cassandra Thornwell stood perfectly still. She didn't salute back. She didn't acknowledge the honors being rendered. She just stood there, eyes on the distant mountains, hands loose at her sides, looking like someone who'd walked out of history into a world that had moved on without her. Captain Victoria Kincaid, standing at attention with everyone else, felt tears streaming down her face and didn't understand why. Her arm was locked in salute, her spine rigid, her mind trying to process what had just been announced. Phantom, 20 confirmed eliminations, black file operations. The woman she'd humiliated, mocked, forced to stand in the sun like a criminal. Sergeant Morrison was trembling, his salute wavering, his face the color of old ash. Lieutenant Hartley stood at his window, his coffee cup forgotten and cold, his hand raised in salute toward a woman he'd never met, but whose file he'd now desperately need to find, to understand, to make sense of. Dr. Whitmore, standing just outside the medical tent, held his salute with tears in his eyes, thinking of those scars and what they represented, and the courage it must have taken to survive whatever had created them. And General Marcus Webb, emerging from the tent on unsteady legs, raised his hand in salute to the woman who'd been declared dead on his watch, abandoned on his authority, mourned with honors that had been hollow because they'd failed her when it mattered. Cassandra finally moved. She reached into her left boot, movements slow and deliberate, and withdrew something small and dark that glinted in the sunlight. A data chip, black polymer no bigger than a quarter, with a serial number etched into its surface that only 3 people on the base would have recognized. She held it up, high enough for everyone to see. "I didn't come back to stay," she said, her voice carrying across the silent field with perfect clarity. "I came back to deliver this." She lowered her arm, placed the chip in her palm, and looked directly at General Webb. "And to make sure everyone knows the truth," she continued, "about what happened in Belgrade, about who gave the orders, about who was left behind." The words hung in the air like smoke after gunfire. Webb's face went from white to gray. Somewhere in the crowd, Captain Victoria Kincaid felt the world beginning to tilt beneath her feet, because she knew, with absolute certainty, that the truth Cassandra was talking about would destroy someone, and she had a terrible suspicion she knew who. The sun climbed higher, the salutes held, and Cassandra Thornwell, codename Phantom, stood in the center of Fort Carson with a data chip that contained 5 years of secrets and waited for the next move in a game she'd been playing since the night she dragged herself out of the ruins of Belgrade with 1 foot missing and a promise burning in her chest. The game wasn't over. It had only just begun. The conference room in Fort Carson's command building had been built to withstand a direct hit from everything short of a bunker buster. Reinforced concrete walls 2 feet thick, triple-paned bulletproof windows, electronic countermeasures built into the ceiling that could scramble any listening device within 100 yards. It was a room designed for secrets, and right now it held the kind of secret that could topple governments. General Marcus Webb sat at the head of the table, his hands folded in front of him to keep them from shaking. To his right, Captain Victoria Kincaid perched on the edge of her chair, her spine rigid with the kind of tension that comes from watching your entire worldview crack like thin ice. Lieutenant Owen Hartley had positioned himself near the door, a laptop open in front of him, ready to verify or debunk whatever was about to be revealed. Dr. Whitmore stood against the wall, his medical bag at his feet, looking like a man who'd seen the X-ray of his own mortality. Sergeant Morrison wasn't there. Webb had dismissed him to his quarters, with orders not to speak to anyone about what he'd witnessed. The sergeant had left looking like he'd aged 10 years in the past 3 hours. Cassandra stood near the windows, backlit by the afternoon sun streaming through the fortified glass. She'd pulled her hair back with a rubber band someone had given her, revealing the sharp angles of her face. That data chip sat in the center of the conference table like a small black sun, and everyone's orbit seemed to curve around it. "Before we proceed," Webb said, his voice rough with emotion, "I need to confirm what we all saw in that field. The biometric data, the scars, the tattoo." He stopped himself. He'd already verified everything in the tent. The woman sitting across from him was Commander Cassandra Thornwell. Phantom. Alive. "You want more proof?" Cassandra asked quietly, reading his hesitation. "Ask me something only Phantom would know." Webb's mind raced through a dozen possibilities, classified details that would confirm beyond doubt. "Operation Sandstorm," he said finally. "The target in Karachi, 2014. What was the secondary objective?" "There was no secondary objective," Cassandra replied without hesitation. "That was misinformation fed to ISI assets to flush out the leak in our intelligence chain. The real operation was 20 miles south, and the target was an asset in place who'd been selling our personnel files to Taliban leadership." She paused. "You wrote the after-action report yourself, filed it under the codename Broken Arrow 7. The report concluded that the leak had been feeding information for 8 months and had resulted in the deaths of 4 operatives and 12 local assets." The room was silent. Webb's face had gone pale because every word she'd said was correct, down to the code name that existed in files only he and 2 other people had access to. Hartley was typing rapidly on his laptop, his eyes wide. "Sir, I'm cross-referencing the biometric data from the gate scan this morning with archived Phantom program files. I need your authorization code to access them." Webb rattled off a 12-digit sequence without taking his eyes off Cassandra. Hartley entered it, waited while the system processed, then looked up with an expression somewhere between awe and horror. "Positive match," he said quietly. "Fingerprints, retinal scan, even the gait analysis. The limp in her left leg matches an injury notation from March 2018. Partial ACL tear sustained during extraction in Bogota." "That healed," Cassandra said. "The current limp is from something else." She reached down, began unlacing her left boot. The action was so matter-of-fact, so devoid of drama, that it took a moment for everyone to process what they were seeing. The boot came off. Below the ankle, her leg was carbon fiber and titanium. The prosthetic was military grade, the kind issued to soldiers who'd lost limbs in combat. But it was also clearly old. The carbon fiber scratched and worn, the joint mechanism showing signs of heavy use without proper maintenance. This wasn't something she'd gotten from a VA hospital. This was something she'd been living with, alone, for years. Kincaid made a small sound in the back of her throat, something between a gasp and a sob. Whitmore moved forward, his medical instincts overriding protocol. "May I?" Cassandra nodded. The doctor knelt, examining the prosthetic with gentle, practiced hands. He checked the socket interface, the pressure points, the way the artificial limb connected to what remained of her leg. "This amputation," he said slowly, "was performed without proper surgical equipment. I can see scarring consistent with field amputation. And the healing," he looked up at her. "You did this yourself." "Most of it," Cassandra confirmed. "A fisherman found me 3 days after Belgrade. By then I'd already removed the destroyed tissue and sealed the major vessels. He helped with the rest." Webb found his voice, though it came out rougher than he intended. "The explosion, October 15th, 2019. We had satellite imagery of the entire facility collapsing. The blast radius was—" "I was in the sub-basement when it detonated," Cassandra said. "The explosion wasn't meant to destroy the facility. It was meant to seal me inside it, to make sure I couldn't walk away." She reached for the data chip, held it up to catch the light. "This chip contains the mission logs from Operation Ghost Rain. Every communication, Every order, every request for extraction that was denied. Her gray eyes moved across the faces in the room. It also contains proof of who ordered me abandoned and why. Webb's hands gripped the edge of the table. Commander Thornwell, whatever happened in Belgrade, you thought I died completing the mission, she finished for him. You thought the explosion was enemy action, collateral damage from a successful operation. She placed the chip down, spun it slowly on the table. You were wrong. Hartley leaned forward. Commander, if someone ordered you abandoned, that's a court-martial offense. Dereliction of duty. Potentially murder. Who gave the order? Cassandra didn't answer immediately. She stood, moved back to the window, looked out at the mountains rising in the distance. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that made everyone in the room feel the temperature drop. Before I answer that, you need to understand what Ghost Rain actually was. She turned back to face them. The official file says I was sent to Belgrade to eliminate 3 targets. High-value individuals connected to human trafficking networks operating out of the Balkans. The targets were real, and I did eliminate them, but that wasn't the primary mission. Webb's brow furrowed. I read the brief myself. There was no mention of, because you weren't cleared for the actual operation, Cassandra said. Ghost Rain was a joint op between DoD and CIA. The trafficking targets were cover. The real objective was to retrieve intelligence that one of those targets had been gathering. Evidence of American officials taking payments from foreign governments. The words fell into the room like stones into still water, rippling outward in waves of implication. Kincaid's voice was barely a whisper. Who? Cassandra looked at her for a long moment, and something that might have been sympathy moved across her face. Your father, she said quietly. General Sullivan Cross. The color drained from Kincaid's face. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. No sound came out. That's impossible, Webb said, but his voice lacked conviction. Cross retired honorably. He served for 43 years. He was decorated, respected. He was also desperate, Cassandra interrupted. His wife's medical bills from her cancer treatment had bankrupted him. His retirement pay wasn't enough, and someone noticed that desperation and offered him a way out. She moved to Hartley's laptop. May I? The lieutenant nodded, pushing the computer toward her. Cassandra inserted the data chip into the USB port, her fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. A directory structure appeared on the screen, folders within folders, each labeled with dates and operation names. I discovered the evidence 3 days before Ghost Rain was scheduled to launch, she said, clicking through files. One of the trafficking targets, a man named Dmitry Volkov, had been collecting intelligence on corrupt American officials. Insurance policy, leverage, who knows? But he had documents, recordings, financial records. She opened a folder. Inside were dozens of files, scanned bank statements, encrypted email transcripts, audio recordings with timestamps and metadata. Sullivan Cross accepted $12.4 million between 2014 and 2019, Cassandra said, her voice taking on the flat, recitative quality of someone reading from a report. He sold operational schedules, personnel files, intelligence assessments. The information he provided led directly to the deaths of 18 American service members and intelligence assets. Webb stood up so fast his chair toppled backward. Show me. Cassandra opened a file. It was a bank statement from a Cayman Islands account, showing a deposit of $800,000 on March 15, 2016. The transfer notation read simply, consultation fee. She opened another file. An email sent from an encrypted account to another encrypted account. The header showed it had been routed through proxy servers in 3 countries, but the metadata, timestamps, IP fragments that hadn't been properly scrubbed, told a story. The email read, package delivered as discussed. JSOC operational schedule for Kabul district attached. Confirm receipt and transfer, second payment. Hartley had gone pale. That operation, March 2016. That was the Kabul safe house raid. 4 SEALs were killed when they walked into an ambush. Because the Taliban knew they were coming, Cassandra said. Because Cross sold them the operational schedule 18 hours before the raid launched. She opened file after file, each one a separate knife wound in the honor of an institution built on sacrifice and trust. Personnel files sold to hostile intelligence services. Safe house locations compromised. Agent networks exposed. Each transaction carefully documented. The digital breadcrumbs of treason laid out in spreadsheets and encrypted communications. Kincaid was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face. No, he wouldn't. He was a patriot. He believed in not losing his house, Cassandra said, and there was no cruelty in her voice, just the steady recitation of facts. He believed in paying his wife's medical bills. He believed in maintaining the lifestyle he thought he'd earned after 4 decades of service. She turned to face Kincaid directly. And when I discovered the evidence, when I contacted my handler and reported what I'd found, someone made a decision. Webb's voice was barely audible. What decision? That the evidence needed to disappear, and so did I. Cassandra's eyes were distant now, looking at something only she could see. I completed the Ghost Rain objectives on October 7th, eliminated all 3 targets, retrieved Volkov's files. I called for extraction on October 8th at 02:45 hours, 15 minutes before my scheduled pickup. She paused, and when she continued, her voice had taken on a different quality, harder, colder, carrying the weight of 5 years of survival and rage. The voice that answered wasn't my usual handler. It was someone else. Someone who told me extraction was denied. Someone who told me to stand by for new coordinates, new objectives. She looked directly at Webb. Someone who knew that facility was rigged to collapse. Someone who was counting on me being inside when it did. Hartley was typing again, pulling up archived communications logs, cross-referencing timestamps. The voice, did you recognize it? Not then, Cassandra said. The connection was degraded, probably deliberately, but I recorded it anyway. Standard protocol. Every field communication gets logged to the chip. She tapped the laptop. File 7-3 Alpha, October 8th, 02:46 hours. Hartley opened the file. An audio player appeared on screen, the waveform showing peaks and valleys of human speech. He hit play. Static hissed through the laptop speakers. Then a voice, male, distorted by encryption and distance but still intelligible. Phantom, this is command. Extraction is denied. Repeat, extraction is denied. Cassandra's voice, younger, with an edge of stress that the current Cassandra no longer seemed capable of displaying. Command, say again? I'm 15 minutes from pickup window. New objectives have been identified. Stand by for coordinates. Negative command, I have compromised cover. Local security is activated. I need immediate extraction. Those are your orders, Commander. Out. The recording ended. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the building's ventilation system. Run voice analysis, Webb said hoarsely. Compare it against... Already running, Hartley interrupted, his fingers dancing across the keyboard, cross-referencing against archived voice samples from all personnel with command authority over Ghost Rain operations. They waited. 30 seconds. 45. The progress bar on Hartley's screen crept forward with agonizing slowness. Then it stopped. A single name appeared on the screen, highlighted in red with a confidence rating of 94.7% match. Cross, Sullivan J., General, U.S. Army, Retet. Kincaid made a sound like she'd been punched in the stomach. She stood up, knocking her chair backward, and stumbled toward the door. Webb moved to stop her, but Cassandra raised a hand. Let her go, she said quietly. She needs time. Kincaid fled. They heard her footsteps echoing down the corridor, running, desperate to be anywhere but in that room with that truth. Webb sank back into his chair, looking 20 years older than he had an hour ago. He ordered you to stay in that facility knowing it was going to collapse. He counted on me following orders, Cassandra said. He counted on my training, my conditioning, my belief that command knew better than I did. A ghost of something that might have been a smile touched her lips. But I'd been Phantom for 7 years by then. I'd learned to trust my instincts more than voices on the radio. What did you do? I ignored the order, started moving toward the extraction point anyway. But Cross must have had a backup plan because the facility's fire suppression system activated, flooded the corridors with halon gas. I had maybe 30 seconds before I'd lose consciousness. She touched her throat absently, fingers tracing a scar that was barely visible. I went down instead of up, found a maintenance shaft that led to the sub-basement, sealed myself in. Whitmore had been listening in horrified fascination. The explosion. You were in a sub-basement when the building collapsed? The charges were placed on the main support columns, Cassandra said, designed to bring the structure down on itself. The sub-basement was below the collapse zone, but the concussive force, she gestured to her missing foot. Debris came through the ceiling, rebar, concrete, a support beam. It crushed everything below my ankle. The pain was, she stopped, chose different words, irrelevant. I had to get out before the secondary collapse. How? Hartley asked, unable to keep the awe from his voice. Cassandra's eyes went distant again. There was a car jack in the maintenance bay, hydraulic. I used it as a tourniquet and cutting surface. The amputation took 40 minutes. I passed out twice from blood loss. But I had iodine tablets to prevent infection, and I'd sealed the major vessels with a blowtorch from the same maintenance bay. The clinical way she described it made it somehow worse. Webb found himself imagining this woman, trapped in darkness beneath tons of collapsed building, cutting off her own foot with a car jack and a blowtorch, while her commanding officer's voice echoed in her head. "Those are your orders, Commander." After that, Cassandra continued, I crawled through the drainage system. The Danube River runs under that part of Belgrade. I followed the water flow for 2 days, floating when I could, dragging myself when I couldn't. A Croatian fisherman found me on the riverbank. He thought I was dead. When he realized I wasn't, he took me to a rural clinic run by Catholic nuns who didn't ask questions. "And you never contacted anyone," Webb said. "Never let us know you were alive." I couldn't. Not until I understood who'd betrayed me and why. She looked at the data chip. It took me 9 months to recover enough to function. Another year to access the files I'd hidden before the collapse. I'd uploaded Volkov's evidence to a secure server as a failsafe. Then 3 more years to verify everything, to gather additional proof, to make sure when I came forward there would be no doubt. Hartley was scrolling through more files now, his expression growing darker with each new revelation. These transactions continued even after Ghost Rain. Cross kept selling information until February 2020, when he retired. He probably figured I was dead and the evidence was buried with me, Cassandra said. He was almost right. Webb stood, paced to the window, stood looking out at Fort Carson stretching beneath the Colorado sky. His entire career, everything he'd built, was founded on the principle that soldiers didn't abandon each other, that the mission mattered, but the people mattered more, that you brought everyone home, even if it meant bringing them home in a box. Sullivan Cross had violated every one of those principles, had sent a woman to die to cover his own crimes, had counted on her death, planned for it, orchestrated it, and then had attended her memorial service with a straight face. "Where is Cross now?" Webb asked quietly. "Williamsburg, Virginia," Hartley said, still scrolling through data on his laptop. "He bought a house there with his retirement pay and—" He stopped, looked up sharply. "And with a $500,000 consulting fee from a shell corporation 3 months after Ghost Rain." "Blood money," Whitmore said. "Payment for making the problem go away." Webb pulled out his phone, started to dial, then stopped. He looked at Cassandra. "This evidence, it's admissible?" Every file is verified and authenticated, she replied. Chain of custody documented. Digital signatures intact. I spent 5 years making sure it would stand up in any court, military or civilian. And you came here, to Fort Carson. Why not go directly to the DOJ, to military justice, to— Because I needed witnesses, Cassandra interrupted. I needed people to see me, to hear my voice, to know that I'm not a ghost or a conspiracy theory or a conveniently dead operator whose story can be rewritten. She looked around the room. I needed to stand in front of active duty military and make them understand what was done, what Cross did, what it cost. The door opened. Kincaid stood there, her face blotchy from crying, her eyes red but determined. She'd composed herself, straightened her uniform, wiped her tears. When she spoke, her voice was steady. I want to help, she said. Whatever you need to bring him to justice. He's my father, but he's also a traitor. And if what you're saying is true, her voice cracked slightly, if it's true, then he doesn't deserve mercy. Cassandra studied her for a long moment. You understand what this means? For you, for your career, for your family? I understand that 18 people died because of him, Kincaid said. I understand that you were left to die because of him. I understand that every value he claimed to represent was a lie. She straightened her shoulders. I'm Captain Victoria Kincaid, United States Army, and I will not protect a traitor, even if he shares my blood. Something in Cassandra's expression softened, just fractionally. She nodded once. Webb had his phone to his ear now, speaking in clipped, urgent tones. This is General Webb at Fort Carson. I need a secure line to the Secretary of Defense. Authorization code Tango 7 November 4 Delta. Yes, I'll hold. While they waited, Cassandra moved back to the window. The sun was lower now, painting the mountains in shades of amber and gold. Somewhere out there, beyond the visible horizon, Sullivan Cross was probably sitting in his Virginia house, drinking bourbon and reading the newspaper, secure in the knowledge that his crimes were buried with a woman he'd condemned to death. He had no idea that death had learned to walk again. The door opened once more. 3 figures entered, not in sequence but together, moving with the synchronized purpose of people who'd arrived at the same destination from different directions. The first was a woman in her early 60s, gray hair cut short, wearing the stars of a 2-star general on her collar. Her face was carved from granite, eyes sharp enough to cut glass. Elena Briggs, who'd run the Phantom program from a desk in the Pentagon and who'd written the after-action report declaring Cassandra Thornwell killed in action. The second was a man in his mid-60s, built like a linebacker gone slightly soft, but still carrying the weight of authority in every movement. Raymond Blackwood, Joint Chiefs of Staff, who'd authorized more black operations than most people knew existed. The third was a woman in her late 50s, wearing a civilian suit but carrying herself with military precision. Margaret Aldrich, Secretary of Defense, the first woman to hold the position, who'd made her career on being tougher than everyone else in every room. They looked at Cassandra. She looked back. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Briggs crossed the room in 3 long strides and did something that made everyone freeze. She pulled Cassandra into a fierce embrace. 5 years, Briggs whispered, her voice breaking. 5 goddamn years we thought you were gone. Cassandra stood rigid in the embrace, her arms at her sides, her body not quite accepting the contact. But her eyes closed, just for a moment, and when they opened again there was something in them that might have been pain, or might have been relief, or might have been the simple acknowledgement that some part of her long isolation had finally ended. Briggs stepped back, wiping her eyes unselfconsciously. Show me, she said. Show me everything. And Cassandra did. For the next 2 hours, she walked them through every file, every transaction, every piece of evidence she'd gathered during 5 years of living as a ghost. She showed them the bank records, the communications intercepts, the metadata that proved beyond doubt that Sullivan Cross had sold American lives for money and had tried to murder the one person who discovered his treason. She played them the audio logs from Ghost Rain, her increasingly desperate requests for extraction, Cross's cold denials, the final transmission where she reported that the facility was collapsing, and if anyone received the message, they should tell her sister she was sorry. She showed them medical records from the Croatian clinic where she'd spent 9 months learning to walk again with a prosthetic foot that she'd paid for by selling everything she had except the clothes on her back and the data chip hidden in a waterproof container she'd swallowed. She showed them 3 years of careful investigation, moving through Europe and the Middle East, verifying every detail, cross-referencing every transaction, building a case that could withstand any scrutiny because she'd known that coming back from the dead meant she got exactly one chance to make people believe her. When she finished, the sun had set. Fort Carson's lights glowed against the darkness outside the windows. Inside the conference room, 4 generals, a doctor, a technical officer, and a woman who'd been declared dead sat in silence, processing the weight of what they'd learned. Secretary Aldrich spoke first. "I want Sullivan Cross in custody within the hour. I want every asset he owns frozen. I want every communication he's had in the past 5 years analyzed." She looked at Cassandra. "And I want you to know that what happened to you, what was done to you, is unforgivable. The United States military failed you. I failed you. We will do everything in our power to make this right." "I don't want apologies," Cassandra said quietly. "I want justice. I want every family member of every person who died because of Cross's betrayal to know the truth. I want his name stripped from every honor, every commendation, every record. I want history to remember him not as a decorated general, but as what he actually was, a traitor who sold his people for money." "You'll have it," Aldrich promised. "All of it." Blackwood was on his phone, speaking in tones too low to hear. Briggs was entering commands into her own laptop, her face set in an expression that suggested someone was about to have a very bad day. Kincaid stood near the door, her arms wrapped around herself, looking like she was holding pieces of her broken world together through sheer force of will. And Cassandra stood by the window, watching her reflection in the darkened glass, seeing the ghost she'd been and the woman she'd become, and wondering if there was any way to bridge the distance between them. Outside, 3 military police vehicles were already rolling toward the main gate, carrying officers with arrest warrants and instructions to move with extreme prejudice. Inside, Webb approached Cassandra, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "What will you do?" he asked. "After this, after the trial, the testimony, the justice you've earned, what will you do?" Cassandra was quiet for a long time. Then she turned to face him, and in her gray eyes he saw something he hadn't seen before. Not hardness or distance or the cold calculation of a trained killer, but simple, profound exhaustion. "I'm going to disappear again," she said, "but this time I'm going to choose where I go, who I become, how I live." She touched the window glass, her fingers leaving faint prints on the surface. "I'm going to remember what it's like to be human instead of a weapon. I'm going to find my sister and tell her I'm sorry. I'm going to sit by a lake and watch the sun rise without calculating sight lines and exit vectors." "You've earned it," Webb said. "God knows you've earned it." Cassandra's hand dropped from the glass. 18 people died because I wasn't fast enough to stop Cross before he sold the information that killed them. I survived when better people didn't. I don't know if I've earned peace, but I'm going to try to find it anyway." She walked toward the door, her gait carrying that mechanical hitch that would mark her forever as someone who'd paid pieces of herself for things most people would never understand. At the threshold, she paused, looked back at the room full of people who'd been part of her past and would now be part of bringing her betrayer to justice. "Thank you," she said simply, "for believing me, for not making me fight this battle alone." Then she walked out into the corridor, leaving behind the conference room and the data chip and the evidence of 5 years spent preparing for this moment. She had one more thing to do before she could truly let Phantom die and Cassandra Thornwell try to live. She had to look Sullivan Cross in the eye and watch him realize that his victim had returned from the grave. And she had to do it without becoming the very thing he tried to make her. A killer who justified any action, any cost, any sacrifice in service of a mission. The hardest battles she'd learned weren't fought with knives in the dark. They were fought in the light, with witnesses, where winning meant keeping your humanity intact even when every instinct screamed to let it go. Outside, the Colorado night was clear and cold, the stars sharp as broken glass scattered across black velvet. And somewhere in Virginia, Sullivan Cross's phone was about to ring with news that would destroy everything he'd built on the bodies of the people he'd betrayed. Justice, Cassandra thought, tastes like ashes and satisfaction in equal measure. She was about to find out which flavor would last longer. The military police convoy reached Williamsburg, Virginia at 3:47 a.m., moving through streets where colonial history slept beside modern convenience stores and the weight of 4 centuries pressed down on brick and cobblestone. Sullivan Cross's house sat on a quiet cul-de-sac where retired generals and prosperous lawyers maintained their lawns with obsessive precision and flew American flags that snapped in the wind off the James River. Cross had bought the house in March 2020, 4 months after Cassandra Thornwell's memorial service. Federal colonial style, brick facade, white columns flanking the entrance. The kind of house that announced its owner had arrived, had succeeded, had earned the right to grow old in dignity and comfort. The MPs surrounded the property with clinical efficiency. No sirens, no drama, just the quiet deployment of overwhelming force. When they knocked on the door at 3:52 a.m., Sullivan Cross answered in a bathrobe and slippers, his silver hair uncombed, his face creased from sleep and suddenly slack with the kind of fear that comes from being woken by uniforms in the dark. "General Cross," the lead MP said, his voice carrying no inflection whatsoever, "you are under arrest for treason, espionage, conspiracy to commit murder, and violations of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, too numerous to list at this time. You have the right to remain silent." Cross tried to speak, failed, tried again. "There must be some mistake. I'm a retired general. I served my country for 43 years, the MP interrupted. "We know. We also know about the $12.4 million. We know about the 18 people who died. We know about Belgrade." The color drained from Cross's face so fast he swayed on his feet. His hands came up, palms out, the universal gesture of someone trying to push away reality through sheer will. "Belgrade," he whispered. She was KIA. The report said, "The report was wrong," the MP said. "Commander Thornwell survived. She's alive, and she's testifying." Sullivan Cross's legs gave out. He sat down hard on his entryway floor, his bathrobe falling open, revealing an old man's chest gone soft with age and comfort bought with blood money. He looked up at the MPs with eyes that had seen command and respect, and now saw only the approaching darkness of consequences finally arrived. "Oh God," he said. "Oh my God." They cuffed him there on the floor of his entryway, read him his rights in voices that carried the weight of absolute certainty, and led him out into the Virginia night while neighbors' lights began to flicker on and curtains twitched with the kind of curiosity that would turn to gossip by morning. 2,000 miles west, Cassandra Thornwell stood in the same conference room where she'd laid out the evidence of Cross's betrayal. The data chip had been removed, sealed in an evidence container, and placed in a safe that required 3 separate biometric authorizations to open. But the weight of what she'd carried for 5 years, the proof, the certainty, the mission, still hung in the air like smoke that wouldn't dissipate. General Webb had gone to coordinate with military justice. Secretary Aldrich had returned to Washington on a helicopter that had landed and departed within 20 minutes, carrying with her a rage so cold it could have frozen the Potomac. Briggs and Blackwood remained, along with Hartley and Whitmore, because some truths are too heavy to witness alone. Captain Victoria Kincaid sat in a chair near the window, her face illuminated by the pale glow of her phone. She'd been scrolling through news articles about her father, commendations, promotion announcements, retirement ceremony coverage where generals had praised his service and sacrifice. Each article was a knife wound, not because they were lies exactly, but because they were incomplete truths that had hidden something monstrous underneath. "He used to read me bedtime stories," she said suddenly, her voice hollow. "When I was little, before deployments. He'd do all the voices, make me laugh." She looked up at Cassandra. "How do I reconcile that man with the one who left you to die?" Cassandra moved to the window, stood beside Kincaid but didn't sit. "You don't," she said quietly. "People aren't puzzles that resolve into single, coherent pictures. Your father loved you and also sold information that killed 18 people. Both things are true. Neither one cancels out the other. But which one is the real him? Both. Neither." Cassandra's reflection in the dark window looked like a ghost superimposed over the living woman. He made choices. The choices revealed who he was. That's all anyone is, the sum of their decisions when it cost them something to decide. Kincaid's phone buzzed. She glanced at it and her face went white. "They have him. He's in custody." The room fell silent. This was the moment, the fulcrum point where everything that had been building for 5 years finally tipped from potential to actual. Sullivan Cross was no longer a free man, making excuses to himself in a house bought with blood money. He was a prisoner, and the machinery of military justice was grinding into motion with the inexorable weight of tanks rolling over broken ground. "I need to see him," Cassandra said. Briggs looked up sharply. "That's not advisable. You're a witness, possibly the key witness. Any contact with the accused before trial could compromise." "I survived for 5 years on the promise that I would look him in the eye when this moment came," Cassandra interrupted, her voice carrying an edge of something that might have been steel or might have been breaking glass. "I need him to see me, to know that trying to bury me failed. That's not negotiable." Briggs and Blackwood exchanged glances. Some silent communication passed between them, the kind of understanding that comes from decades of making decisions that would haunt their sleep. "Fort Myer," Blackwood said finally. "We'll transport him there for initial processing. You can see him then. 5 minutes, monitored, no physical contact. That's all I need." 3 days passed in a blur of depositions and documentation. Cassandra sat in rooms with military lawyers who recorded her testimony with the kind of meticulous care usually reserved for diffusing explosives. She walked them through every detail: the mission brief, the discovery of Cross's treason, the communications from Belgrade, the explosion, the amputation, the 5 years spent building a case that could survive any scrutiny. She spoke in the same flat, clinical tone she'd used to describe amputating her own foot, and the lawyers wrote down every word with faces that grew progressively more horrified as the hours accumulated. Kincaid attended every session, sitting in the back of the room, watching the destruction of her father's legacy unfold in recorded testimony and authenticated evidence. Sometimes she cried silently. Sometimes she sat with her jaw clenched so tight the muscles jumped in her cheeks. But she never left. "Why do you keep coming?" Cassandra asked on the second day, during a break when the lawyers had stepped out to consult on some procedural question. "Because I need to hear it," Kincaid said. "All of it, every detail. I need to understand exactly what he did so I can never make excuses for him. So I can never let myself believe it wasn't as bad as it was." "That's going to hurt for a long time." "Good," Kincaid said, and there was something like her father's iron will in her voice, but bent toward different purposes. "It should hurt. Betrayal should hurt. And I'm going to carry that hurt until it transforms into something better, into being the kind of officer he pretended to be." On the third day, they brought Sullivan Cross to Fort Myer. The holding facility was underground, accessed through a series of checkpoints that required retinal scans and authentication codes that changed every 6 hours. Cross had been processed, photographed, fingerprinted, and stripped of everything except an orange jumpsuit that hung loose on his frame. He'd lost weight in 3 days, the kind of rapid deterioration that comes from stress eating through flesh like acid. They placed him in an interrogation room, concrete walls, metal table, chairs bolted to the floor. A camera in the corner recorded everything with a red light that never blinked. 2 MPs stood outside the door, stone-faced and silent. Cassandra entered at 1400 hours exactly, flanked by Briggs and Webb. She'd refused their suggestion to wear her dress uniform, appeared instead in the same faded combat fatigues she'd worn walking onto Fort Carson. The prosthetic foot made a faint, mechanical whisper with each step, a sound that seemed louder than it should have been in the concrete silence. Cross looked up when the door opened. His eyes found Cassandra, widened, and for a moment his entire body went rigid with the kind of shock that comes from seeing the dead walk. "No," he whispered. "No, you're not. You can't be." Cassandra pulled out the chair across from him, sat down with deliberate slowness. Up close, she could see how the 3 days had aged him. New lines around his eyes, a tremor in his hands, the collapse of certainty that comes from having your worst nightmare confirmed. "Hello, General," she said quietly. "Surprised?" Cross's mouth worked soundlessly. His hands came up, touched his face as if checking that he was actually awake, actually experiencing this and not trapped in some fever dream. When he finally found his voice, it came out cracked and hoarse. "The explosion. The building collapsed. We had satellite confirmation." "You had confirmation that the building came down," Cassandra corrected. "You assumed I was inside because that's what you'd planned. That's what you'd counted on when you denied my extraction and triggered the demolition charges early." "I didn't. It wasn't—" Cross stopped, started again. "You don't understand. They were threatening my family. My wife was dying. We had no money. They said they could help if I just provided some information." 18 people, Cassandra said, her voice cutting through his explanations like a blade through fog. 18 Americans died because of the information you sold. 4 SEALs in Kabul, 3 CIA officers in Damascus, 6 diplomats in Mogadishu, 5 contractors in Baghdad. She leaned forward slightly. "Do you remember their names, General? Or were they just abstract numbers to you?" Cross's face crumpled. Tears began sliding down his cheeks, and he made no move to wipe them away. "I never meant for anyone to die. I thought it was just operational schedules, logistics, nothing that would—" "You knew," Cassandra interrupted. "You knew exactly what you were doing. And when I discovered the evidence, when I found Volkov's files, you made a choice. You could have confessed, faced justice, maybe gotten some consideration for cooperation. Instead, you tried to have me killed." "I had no choice." Cross's voice rose, cracking with desperation. "If you'd come back with those files, everything I'd done, everything I'd built, would have been revealed as a lie built on the bodies of better people than you," Cassandra finished. "Yes, that's exactly what would have happened. That's exactly what's happening now." She stood, and Cross flinched as if expecting violence. But Cassandra just looked down at him. This man who'd once commanded respect and authority, and now sat in an orange jumpsuit with tears on his face and the weight of 18 deaths pressing down on his shoulders. "I spent 5 years surviving what you tried to do to me," she said. "I cut off my own foot to escape the tomb you'd built. I crawled through sewers and floated down rivers and endured pain you can't imagine because I made a promise to myself and to the people you killed." She reached down, pulled up her left pant leg, revealing the prosthetic. Cross stared at it, his face going gray. "I promised I would survive," Cassandra continued. "I promised I would gather the evidence. I promised I would come back and make sure everyone knew what you'd done. And I kept those promises because that's what soldiers do. We keep faith with the mission and with each other, even when the cost is everything we have." She let the pant leg drop, turned toward the door, then paused. "You're going to spend the rest of your life in a cell," she said without turning around. And every day you'll wake up knowing that you betrayed everything you claimed to stand for, that you sold honor for money and lives for comfort, that when it mattered most, when the choice was between being a man of integrity or a coward who murdered to cover his crimes, you chose wrong. I'm sorry, Cross whispered. God help me, I'm so sorry. Cassandra turned back, and her gray eyes held no mercy, no forgiveness, no warmth. Sorry doesn't resurrect the dead, she said. Sorry doesn't give me back the 5 years I spent as a ghost. Sorry is just a word cowards use when they're finally caught. She walked out, the door closing behind her with a metallic click that sounded like finality. In the corridor, Briggs was waiting. How do you feel? Cassandra considered the question, looked for rage or satisfaction or triumph, and found only a vast, echoing emptiness where those emotions should have been. Tired, she said finally. I feel tired. The trial preparations consumed another 2 weeks. Military justice moved with the speed of glaciers, grinding continents into new configurations. And Cassandra found herself trapped in a holding pattern of depositions and briefings, in meetings with lawyers who treated her like fragile evidence that might shatter if handled wrong. She stayed in a small apartment on base, visited daily by Whitmore, who checked her prosthetic and asked gentle questions about her mental state that she answered with the same clinical precision she brought to everything else. She ran every morning despite the mechanical limitations of her foot, pushing herself through miles of pain because pain was familiar and stillness felt like drowning. Kincaid visited on the 5th day, carrying coffee and a carefully neutral expression. The prosecutors want me to testify, she said, settling into a chair across from Cassandra, about his character, his state of mind, whether I ever noticed anything suspicious. Are you going to? Yes, they need to understand that he was a normal father, a normal officer, someone who could smile at his daughter and then order a woman to die without his hands shaking. Kincaid set down her coffee cup. I'm also requesting a transfer. Different unit, different base. I can't serve at Fort Carson anymore. Every time I walk across that training field, I see you standing under the sun with that sign behind you. And I remember that I was part of that. You didn't know. That doesn't make it hurt less. Kincaid met Cassandra's eyes. I wanted to ask, after this is over, after the trial, after everything, what will you do? Cassandra looked out the window at Fort Myers' carefully maintained grounds, at soldiers moving through their duties with the mechanical precision of ants building colonies. I'm going to find my sister, she said. I'm going to tell her I'm sorry for letting her think I was dead for 5 years. I'm going to try to remember what it's like to be someone's family instead of someone's weapon. Will you stay in contact? Let us know you're okay? I don't know, Cassandra said honestly. Part of me wants to disappear so completely that even I can't find myself. Start over somewhere no one knows Phantom or Commander Thornwell. Just be Cass, whoever that is. Kincaid nodded slowly. I understand, but if you ever need anything, if you ever want to talk to someone who understands what it's like to have your entire world rebuilt from rubble. She pulled out a card, placed it on the table. That's my personal number. It won't change, no matter where they transfer me. After she left, Cassandra picked up the card, turned it over in her fingers. Such a small thing, an offering of connection from someone who had every reason to hate her for destroying her father's legacy. She slipped it into her pocket, not certain if she'd ever use it, but unable to simply throw it away. The preliminary hearing happened on a Tuesday in a military courtroom that smelled of furniture polish and the accumulated weight of judgment. Cross sat at the defense table, flanked by 2 military lawyers who'd been assigned his case and looked like they'd rather be anywhere else on earth. He'd aged another decade since Cassandra had seen him. His face collapsed inward like a building after the supports had been removed. Cassandra testified for 6 hours, walking the court through every detail of Ghost Rain and its aftermath. She spoke in that same flat, clinical tone, And when the defense attorney tried to suggest she'd fabricated the evidence during her 5 years off the grid, she calmly produced authentication records and digital signatures that left no room for doubt. The judge, a 3-star general named Harrison, who'd served in Vietnam and carried the quiet authority of someone who'd made peace with his ghosts, listened with a face carved from stone. When Cassandra finished, he called a recess and disappeared into his chambers. When he returned, his face hadn't changed, but something in his eyes suggested he'd been reminded why justice mattered, even when it hurt. Based on the evidence presented, he said, his voice carrying the weight of finality, this court finds sufficient cause to proceed to full court-martial. General Sullivan Cross will be held without bail pending trial. We are adjourned. Cross made a sound like something breaking inside him. The MPs moved to escort him out, and as he passed Cassandra's seat, he stopped, turned toward her. The MPs tensed, hands moving to weapons, but Cross just looked at her with eyes full of something that might have been remorse, or might have been the simple recognition that consequences had finally arrived. I hope you find peace, he said quietly. I truly do, because God knows I never will. Then he was gone, led away to a cell where he would wait for a trial that everyone already knew would end with a guilty verdict and a sentence measured in decades. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Sullivan Cross's defense team mounted the best case they could with the material they had, which amounted to arguing for leniency based on his decades of prior service and his wife's medical expenses. The prosecution countered with the 18 dead, the $12 million, and Cassandra's testimony that left no room for doubt or mercy. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned, their faces told the story before the verdict was read. Guilty on all counts. Cross stood as the sentence was pronounced. Life in military prison, no possibility of parole, dishonorable discharge, forfeiture of all rank and honors. His face remained blank, like a man who'd already departed his own body and left only a shell standing at attention. In the gallery behind Cassandra, 18 families had watched the verdict with faces carved from grief and vindication. A widow in her 50s, the same woman who'd thanked Cassandra at an earlier memorial, stood and approached the barrier that separated spectators from the court floor. Commander Thornwell, she called out, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom. Cassandra turned. Thank you, the woman said, tears streaming freely now. Thank you for giving us the truth, for making sure he pays, for not letting our people die as just numbers in a file. Others stood behind her, fathers who'd lost daughters, mothers who'd lost sons, young men and women who'd lost parents. Families joined by Cross's betrayal and now bound by his conviction. They didn't applaud, they didn't cheer. They just stood in silent acknowledgement that justice, however delayed, had finally arrived. Cassandra nodded once, a gesture that encompassed all of them, all the dead, all the years of waiting. Then she turned and walked out of the courtroom, leaving behind not just Sullivan Cross and his crimes, but the weight of carrying their vengeance alone. Outside the courtroom, reporters shouted questions that military police deflected with practiced efficiency. Cassandra walked past them with her eyes forward, ignoring the cameras, the demands for statements, the pleas for interviews. Emma was waiting by a rental car, and beside her was a young girl with dark hair and gray eyes that looked so much like Cassandra's own, it was like seeing her childhood self reflected in a living mirror. Aunt Cass? The girl, Lily asked, her voice small and uncertain. Is it really you? Cassandra knelt down, bringing herself to eye level with her niece. It's really me, she said. I know this is confusing. I know you thought I was gone, but I'm here now, and I'm so happy to meet you. Lily studied her with the serious intensity of children evaluating whether adults can be trusted. Then she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Cassandra's neck. Mom says you were lost, Lily whispered, but now you're found, like in the Bible story about the sheep. Cassandra held her niece, and felt something crack open in her chest. Some sealed place where she'd stored all the emotions that had no tactical value. Tears came again, and this time she didn't fight them. "Yeah," she whispered back, "like that story. I was lost, and now I'm found." They drove north and west, leaving Washington and its monuments and its machinery of justice behind. Through Virginia's mountains and across the Midwest plains and up into Montana where the sky opened like a promise and the mountains rose like ancient gods who'd seen everything and judged nothing. The cabin at Flathead Lake was exactly as Cassandra remembered it. Weathered wood and a stone chimney, a dock stretching into water so clear you could see the rocks on the bottom. Emma had maintained it through the years, keeping it ready for a return that she'd hoped for, but never quite believed would happen. Cassandra stood on the dock that first evening, watching the sun set over the mountains and paint the lake in shades of amber and rose. Her prosthetic foot made the wooden planks creak slightly with each step, a sound that would never be natural but might, someday, become familiar. Emma came out carrying 2 beers, handed one to Cassandra without comment. They stood side by side, sisters separated by 5 years of grief and lies, but finding their way back to each other in the spaces between words. "What will you do now?" Emma asked. "Now that it's over." Cassandra considered the question, looking out at the lake and the mountains and the vast empty sky that held no threats, no objectives, no missions except the simple act of continuing to exist. "I'm going to teach Lily to fish," she said. "I'm going to learn how to sleep without checking exits. I'm going to sit on this dock and watch the sunrise without calculating sightlines." She took a drink of beer, felt the cold bite of it. "I'm going to try to remember who I was before they made me into Phantom. And if I can't remember, I'm going to figure out who I can be now." "That sounds like a good plan." "It's terrifying," Cassandra admitted. "Missions have clear objectives and completion criteria. Life is just continuing. No endpoints, no success metrics, just the ongoing work of being human." "Welcome to what the rest of us have been doing all along," Emma said with a small smile. "It's messy and confusing, and sometimes it hurts, but it's also beautiful. You'll see." That night, before sleep came, there was a soft knock on Cassandra's door. Lily peered in, clutching a stuffed rabbit that looked older than she was. "Aunt Cass, can I ask you something?" Cassandra sat up. "Of course." Lily padded across the room, climbed onto the bed with the unself-conscious ease of childhood. "Mom said you were hurt really bad, that you were lost for a long time." "That's true. Were you scared?" Cassandra considered lying, offering the sanitized version adults give children. But Lily's gray eyes, so much like her own, deserve better. "Yes," she said quietly. "I was very scared. Sometimes I didn't think I'd make it home." "But you did," Lily said matter of fact. "And now you're here. And tomorrow we're going fishing." "Tomorrow we're going fishing," Cassandra agreed. Lily hugged her rabbit tighter. "I'm glad you came back, Aunt Cass. Mom cries less now." She hopped off the bed and padded back to the door, paused with her hand on the frame. "Good night. Love you." She was gone before Cassandra could respond, leaving only the faint scent of children's shampoo and the ghost of words Cassandra hadn't heard in 12 years. "Love you." Cassandra set her phone aside and closed her eyes. In the darkness, she could still feel the weight of the 3 scars on her back, the ghost of her missing foot, the accumulated cost of 12 years as a weapon aimed at the world's dark places. But she could also hear Emma moving in the next room, the quiet sounds of ordinary domestic life, could smell pine through the open window, could feel the soft mattress beneath her, and the clean sheets, and the simple miracle of safety. For the first time in 5 years, maybe longer, Cassandra Thornwell allowed herself to believe that she might actually survive the peace that came after war. And in the morning she would wake up and take the first step of a different kind of mission. One measured not in objectives completed, but in moments accumulated. Not in enemies eliminated, but in connections rebuilt. Not in survival at any cost, but in living with purpose and grace. She had been Phantom, the ghost who killed in silence and disappeared into shadow. Now she would try to be Cassandra, aunt, sister, survivor, human. It would be the hardest mission of her life, but she had never failed a mission yet, and she didn't intend to start now.